What's up guys, I'm Robin and I make stuff. Sometimes it's fantastic, sometimes it's just what it is, and that's okay. Today we're going to be talking about basic watercolor technique, and this can be brush stroke, how much water to put on your brush, how much paint to have on your brush, how much are we mixing of the water and the paint, how do I get those blooms, how do I not get the blooms because I don't like those things, dry brushing, wet on wet, graded washes, all of those things that you need to really know as a beginning and an advanced artist. Let's buckle up and get right into it. So today I'm going to be using Arches paper, 140 pound fine grain, and I like something that's cold pressed so it does have a little bit of a rough texture. Then I get my masking tape from Harbor Freight. I'll put a link in the description. I put the masking tape across each border of the paper, leaving about 1/4 of an inch or so around the edges. And for this tutorial, I'm just gonna do the edges. I could mask off certain areas, but this is just gonna be kind of a little bit all over the place. Let's talk about brushes. On the left, I have a synthetic sable brush, and on the right, I have a Siberian squirrel brush. Now I wanna show you the difference of how much water each one of these holds and the shape that it retains. The sable brush does not hold a ton of water in comparison to the Siberian squirrel, but it does really retain its shape. Now the squirrel brush, this is true of almost any squirrel, even if it's synthetic, holds a ton of water. Like, it just keeps on coming out. These don't retain their shape as well. As you can see, you push it and it stays where it is. Now I have a flat brush on the left and a round brush on the right, and it's basically self-explanatory. The flat brush is flat and the round brush is held together in a round fashion. I'm going to use both brushes for this tutorial. Here is my palette. It's pretty messy. This is just how I do it. A lot of people have really nice organized paint. This is what I do. So I'm going to clear off a little spot and we're going to just mix up some blue. Now to load your brush with paint, you want to get a lot of paint and a lot of water, but you want that paint to be really opaque, right? So the more paint you get, the darker that color is going to be. If you want to thin it out and have it be a lighter shade of that ultramarine blue, you would just get some water on your brush and then make a new little section on your mixing area. So just way more water and less paint. Now this isn't a ton of paint or water in general. I would need to really get a lot to put it on my paper and have it fill up a large area. So it's kind of like a medium fill, and then I'm gonna get some a little bit darker, which just means more paint, putting more paint on my brush and making sure that it is really wet. If it's not wet enough, you'll be dry brushing, and I'm gonna show you what that looks like here. So you basically dry off your brush, get some paint on it so there's not a lot of water, more paint, less water, and then just lightly glide your brush across the paper. This is going to work a lot better if you have a rough texture on your paper. And again, this is a cold press. A hot press paper would be a more smooth finish. You can get a rough grain or a fine grain. I think this is more of a fine grain in terms of the texture of the paper. But that's how you do dry brushing. Let's talk about wet on wet. That just means you're going to have wet paper first, and then you're going to put your wet paint into it. So I'm loading up my brush here with some paint, and then I'm going to drop some droplets into my water and just let the watercolor paint itself for this example. Now we're going to do some examples where I actually do some washes, which means I'm going to fill in every area, but I want to let this sit here and see what it's going to do. And I do that a lot for my skies. And now let's get some paint on our paper. I'm just putting wet paint onto my dry paper, and then I'm going to clean my brush out, get my brush full of clean water, and then I'm going to paint from the bottom just with water, and then let that water just slightly touch where that wet paint is and just see what happens. It pulls that paint into the water, and I'm going to let it just do its thing, again kind of letting that watercolor paint itself. Let's do a graded wash. And so for a graded wash, you want to put some color down on your paper, which I put wet paint onto my dry paper. Then I clean my brush out, and I'm going back over the bottom edge of where I put that paint down. And I'm going to just continue to do that process of cleaning my brush and then putting on the bottom edge of where I just painted. and letting that paint kind of flow down until it basically is a gradient to 0, clear. It's just the paper is showing through 100%. I'm using my flat brush, and we're going to kind of do that again. So I'm going to paint a little bit on this top section here. Then we're going to clean out the brush and start pulling that paint down. So I want to pull from the bottom edge. I don't want to go back to the top because that's going to pull all that paint from the top down. I just want to have it so it's a gradient of dark to light, and the lightest being the paper, all the way showing all the way through. Very dark at the top and nothing but paper showing on the bottom. And then I can kind of go back through and smooth that out if I want to, and that is a very graded or a gradient wash. Now let's just do a flat wash. So for my flat wash, I'm going to wet my paper, and then I'm going to put the same amount of paint all the way through where I just wet my paper so that it's very even. It's just a flat, even color all the way through, and that will dry very flat and even, which is why they call it a flat wash. Just one solid color all the way through. I kind of like using a flat brush for these examples because it is a very clean, crisp line. Now I'm going to get my paper ready to do a glaze a few steps from now. So for this, I'm going to do a flat wash in a larger area so we can see what a glaze looks like on part of that area and then what the original looks like. I wet my paper and then I get some paint on my brush and just paint a nice even amount of color throughout that entire area. And then I want to let it fully dry before I do my glaze. Let's do some brush strokes. I'm starting with my flat brush. The nice part about a flat brush is that you can really get some straight, even, and very fine point lines. If you're just going to be doing horizontal or vertical lines, it's a great option. So I did some lines, lay my brush flat, and now I'm just using the tip of my brush. And both of those options are pretty similar. They do take a little bit more control. But let's do some where we kind of push a little bit harder on the brush to get a little bit of a thicker stroke. And now if we turn the brush so it's flat and then push down really hard and then come up, we can get a really interesting shape. You can use this a lot for leaves and things like that. And then if I turn it at an angle, start off with that flat edge, push down really hard, and then just the way I'm twisting my brush allows me to get a variation of thickness and stroke in there. You can turn it flat and do vertical strokes as well. So similar to how we did the horizontal lines, if I were to just pull vertically, then I get those nice thick bands in there. It's a great way if you're doing architecture or things that have nice crisp edges. I find that the flat brush works really well. So let's try and replicate those lines and those strokes with the round brush. A little bit more challenging unless I had sort of a long round to get those straight horizontal lines, but you can do a nice kind of thick line where you start and you press down and pull all the way across. And let's do fine point, so press down a little, then press down a lot, and then go back up to a little. Another great way to do leaves or kind of that teardrop effect. And then we're going to press a little, a lot, and then kind of turning my brush like I did with the flat brush, a little bit different in terms of how that stroke looks. I missed some of the paper there, so a little bit less consistent. And then trying to fill a rectangular area is a little bit more challenging. You can see I didn't have enough paint and I got some of that dry brushing effect, so making sure I load up my brush. And then just some horizontal lines, a little bit more challenging to keep the control on that, but I can do some nice dot work and texture with a round brush. You can use this for feathers, texture, where you just kind of push down and then lift up quickly. And let's do that with both. So I'm pushing down and lifting up quickly, and very similar, but also different. I really want you to try this one out because it was even interesting for me to see the difference side by side. And a lot of it is pushing and then twisting, pushing down to that corner and then twisting. Same with the round brush. So don't be afraid to kind of twist with your fingers, and twisting that brush in the palm of your hand and how you're holding it will definitely give you some different effects and different brush strokes. Okay, so back to the glaze. I want to get a lot of paint that's super watered down. So we don't want it to be super opaque unless that's what we're going for. So I'm watering down a bunch of orange here, and then we're going to just drag that across that blue area that we had painted, and you'll see how the color changes. And this is a great way to kind of warm things up or just give something a different hue. So I'm going to leave it there at that point so you can kind of see what happens when I didn't put it on there and then when I did. You can compare. All right, we're going to work on some scratching and lifting techniques. So I have a half of a credit card. I cut it in half. I scratched off my numbers. So in the event that I'm out painting and I leave it, I don't have to worry about it. But it has a round edge, then it has a sharp edge, and it's got some stiffness to it. The other thing you can use is a dull pocket knife. And I just found this for $2 at an antique shop, and it's not sharp at all. I don't even think this would cut anything, but it's great to keep on hand. It's small and can give you some different lines than the credit card would. So I'm going to paint a nice blue area in here, and we're going to talk about the timing, because it's all about the timing of when you're doing your scratching. And that's something that you just have to kind of learn and see, but I'll give you some tips. The first thing we can do is, while it's wet, we can use the back of our paintbrush and just move some of that paint. This is great for grass, fur, hair, or just texture that you need. You can move paint into different areas without really damaging your paper. On the flip side, if we come in here while this paint is super wet, you can see how much shine there is on the paint, and we start moving it around with a credit card or something that's going to affect the surface of the paper, that is going to create some darker lines within the paint itself, because that paper is then absorbing the paint versus moving the paint. So while your paper is really wet and you want to create some darker lines in there, you can do some scratching, and you can see very, very dark. And you can see where it's still shiny. We want to wait until that shine is sort of gone dull. And it's almost still a little bit too wet here, but we're going to start to see that you can move that paint off of the paper and leave the white paper showing through underneath. So you want the paint to be wet, but you don't want it to be too wet. If it's too wet, you're just going to damage the paper and let that paint seep in. And now you can see with my pocket knife that paint is just like the perfect dampness. It's really moving the paint out of the way, and that's what you want to do when you're trying to lift it out. So we're going to do some lifting techniques. I'm using two brushes here. The one on the right, the green brush, is a stiff bristle, and it's more of a true flat brush. And this one on the left is also very stiff, but more of a rounded head. As you can see, it's got a little bit more of a round, curved, tapered edge to it, whereas this one is very flat for straight, really straight lines and a little thinner. So I'm going to put some paint onto my paper, and we're going to lift out paint while it's wet, and we're going to lift out paint when it's dry. And certain paints work better for this. This is ultramarine blue, and it's really easy to lift out because it's not a stain. The first thing we're going to do is use a paper towel, and I'm just dabbing this paper towel, and I've kind of bunched the paper towel together and just kind of dabbing, wisping it, and you can do all sorts of stuff with this: fog, clouds. If you get some paint where you don't like it, you can dab it out and wipe it away. Again, if it's not a staining paint. So that's a great way to lift. Then I'm going to start with my green brush, and I'll put a link to this brush in the description as well. And I clean off my brush and dab some of that water away so it's just damp. And then with that brush, I'm kind of going back and forth and then wiping it on my paper towel, back and forth to lift that paint out and wiping it on my paper towel. If I just keep moving it around, then it's just going to move that paint around. So you got to make sure it's clean and you're cleaning it off from time to time. Now I dried my paint, as you saw, and I'm going to do the same thing now with dry paint, whereas it was wet before. So cleaning my brush, dabbing off my paper towel, and then moving that paint, lifting it out. And now let's do it with this thicker, stiffer bristle brush. This is gonna be a little bit of a thicker line. It's great if you want to like soften edges and things like that, but you can see I can kind of move that paint off and move it to different areas as well. That's why it's important to clean your brush if you don't want to be doing that. But lifting it out, softening that edge, and now we can just move it around a little bit and then dab it with the paper towel. So let's do that again with the green brush. Cleaning my brush, dabbing it off, and then moving it on the paint and then soaking that up with the paper towel. So lots of different ways you can lift paint. Let's talk about masking fluid. Now you can buy masking fluid. I just use rubber cement. The trick with rubber cement is you want to make sure that this brush that's included in here is really cleaned off. If it's not, it will just drip from here to the paper in areas that you don't want it. It's pretty cheap. I'll put a link to this as well in the description. And it may be a little bit harder to see, but you got to get on there pretty thick because that's what's going to dry on the paper and then mask it off so you can paint right over it and the paint doesn't go on the paper. I did an area that was just solid, and now I'm dabbing an area that you might do for clouds or water splashes or snow on a mountain. There's all sorts of ways to use this. So I want to show you the two different options where I put it on very methodically and then just kind of dabbed it in. And then you want to make sure it's 100% dry. It might feel a little tacky, but it should not be wet. And then I'm going to paint right over that rubber cement. And any of the areas that are white are where you're seeing that rubber cement. Now there's a little bit of paint sitting on top of the rubber cement, and that's fine. And there's the dabbed area where I just kind of put it on pretty messy. And then we're going to dry these completely and then rub it off. So now that it's dry, I'm just going to use my finger. You can also get rubber cement remover, it looks like an eraser, and that can take it off, but I just use my finger. Now it's revealing the paper underneath that I can then paint on. And so that was my smoother area. You can see I didn't get it thick enough in some spots, so the paint did go through. And then here's where I dabbed it on, which is great for like a splash of water against a rock or snowy areas on a mountaintop. So once I get that all off of there and I don't feel any more tacky rubber cement, then I can come back and I can paint it. So a lot more speckles where I dabbed it, and a little bit of speckles in here where this solid section was. But I can paint right over it, whatever color I want. I can do some outside glazing, whatever it is that I want to do, or I can come in with a similar color and just kind of put some light areas, fill in, which I would do if I were doing snow, because snow can look blue in the shadows, but just kind of adjusting that a little bit more. And so rubber cement is a really fun tool to have in your bag. This last little open area that we have here in the middle and then along the bottom, I'm going to show you how you can manipulate blooming or why it happens. So generally speaking, a bloom happens when your paint that you've already put down is drying, and then you put more paint that's wet onto that dry area, and that water pushes the paint and picks up what's underneath and then creates this kind of weird watery border. So I'm putting a lot of paint on this square area, and now this bottom area has dried, so I'm going to put some water in there, and it may actually still be too wet to see, but you can see that the paint is just pushing. So I'm going to drop a little bit of water in this corner down here as if I was reworking something, and you can see where it's gotten lighter in that corner. It's a little hard to see, but that's where it would start to create that bloom, and then you can see the blooms kind of happening down in the bottom area as well. And that's about it. Well, that's it for today. I hope that you found this content really valuable. Maybe you learned something new. Maybe you reworked something you've done before. Maybe you just had an aha moment where something finally freaking clicked for you. and that's why I'm here. I've had those moments myself. I appreciate you watching this video all the way to the end. If you found this valuable, please like and subscribe to my channel. Turn on the notifications so you'll be notified when I make more content like this, and leave a comment. If you have questions, I am here for it. I will answer them, I promise. And join me next time when I make stuff.
They wonder how I do it like that. 7 fit flex on the jacks on that.